I've put together my talk, if I have put it together, in a rush, a couple of days. And when I looked at it and read it through on the train this morning, I thought, there's a jump, there's another jump, there's another jump. There are things I wanted to say, and I haven't quite linked them in. So bear with me. You might... I should have tested that first, shouldn't I? Can you... I'll start again. Can you hear me? Is it clear? Okay, good. I had, as a measure of how rushed I've been, I had meant to have a haircut. This is not taking you back to when I first met Bob Cobbing in the 70s. But, you know, time, what happens to it? And then the storm this morning. But there was that chap that in the illustration, you know, with the Gestetner. I should have looked like him. I go to a Barbadian, I think he is, barber in New Cross Road. And I trimmed hair, trimmed beard, you know, and then maybe a bit of plastic surgery, and I looked as good as him. Anyway, so I will do my best not to be too jumpy. This is my subject, Bob Cobbing. I don't know where that was, that picture. And that's another picture of which he was very fond. He used to get very excited whenever he saw that sign around Stockholm. Oh, look, there it is. So, yes, Bob, you've made that joke. Writers' Forum, we don't know how many books Writers' Forum produced. It's a project to add it up, but I'm usually genuinely more interested in doing new things. But somewhere between 1,200 and 1,600 publications, between 1963 and 2002, and then ongoing. But as I shall explain, it doesn't produce so much now. Most of them, but not all, were produced on that kind of, not that machine, but that model of machine. One variation was, can't remember when, but when we produced the 500th book. I say we, I then wasn't so involved in the admin of Writers' Forum. But if you go to that table, you will find among the Haute Gobra books, you will see Verbi Visi Voco, which set out with the aim, at least, of having work by every poet who had ever been published by Writers' Forum. There was a competition, by the way, to name the title, and I won it, but not with the title Verbi Visi Voco. Bob said I'd won, but he didn't think that it would be a very marketable title, which had never bothered him before. My title was Phi Fun Dread. Go away, fear of fun. So that was the kind of thing he liked. He was very fond. If he'd had a couple of drinks, he'd say, he lived in Maida Vale for many years. I'm Maida Vale. Are you Maida Vale? And one tried to laugh. The 750th publication was this. And again, you notice this is litho produced. Given that time had passed and costs had risen, the Arts Council of Great Britain reduced the amount of money they gave us for this. That's words, score, utterance, choreography in verbal and visual poetry. And Bob and I edited this. The origin of that was that we used to go along to the Artist Book Fair, then at the Barbican. And we noticed that people would come along and open our publications. And many of them were large areas of duplicator ink. You'll see some examples in a minute. So they were literally that kind of gesture. I can't quite get it. I've got to try and feel really repulsed. I can't let those visuals out. And out of discussing this, we decided that what we needed was a primer to explain how some aspects of the work that was published came to be, what its bases were, what its methods were. I said to Bob, well, when you've got the money to produce that litho book, let me know. One day he sat down beside me in the pub, we're often in the pub, and said, so, when are you coming over to edit this book? I said, have you got the grant? He said, yeah. And that was how word, score, utterance, choreography went. We aimed to have 3 pages for each artist. Some got more, some didn't reply. I think it's good. I'm quite proud of that one. So you can see these are battered copies which I brought along. If you want to look at that, please ask me, and I will gladly let you look at it, or chain your arm or something. He had an exhibition at the Kjolfrith Arts Centre up in the northeast in the early 70s. And they produced a publication for Bob Cobbingham Writers' Forum. One day I went over to Bob's in Maida Vale, and he was copying, scanning and printing this litho book, not this one, but the first edition, onto the Gestetner. I just stared at him. There was paper everywhere. After he died, I thought we need to do that again. But I'm not going to duplicate that. I didn't have a duplicator apart from anything else. So I managed to raise the money and went to a commercial printer. But do bear in mind, if you want to look at this, that at some point the man duplicated this book about himself. I'm not in the, well, I am. I helped translate a little bit by the Swedish composer Sten Hansson, but apart from that, not. This was Bob's last publication. This is a posthumous print. I found a copy of it in his map shelves, and asked his wife what that was, and she said, "Oh, he didn't want that seen. Tell me more." And he had been producing this thing on a photocopier on the kitchen table, and he sent it to someone whose opinion he valued very greatly, who wrote back to him not admiringly. And he just put it away. He didn't want to. He was too upset, apparently. He did do some performances of it in the January before he died in September. So I said, I think that's good. Do you? Yes. Can I have it? Can I publish it? And again, I had to fundraise. I stress this was before 2008, when people would actually say, how much do you need? Of course, that stopped a little bit. And the final example I've got, I mean, you'll see in these books, and I've got a couple of images on the screen, but this is the last book I've got. This is post-Cobbing Writers' Forum. This is by the Chilean poet Martin Gubbins, who came over. He's a lawyer. He came over to expand his horizons, and he went to UCL to study English literature. for a master's. And, well, we'll keep it to ourselves, but he was appalled at the attitude, because he said, they don't want to know about modernism. They know a bit of modernism, but, well, he explained the reason he was there was he had said that to someone, and they said, oh, you want to go to Writers' Forum, you want to meet Bob Cobbing, he'll show you what can be done in poetry. And this book, he's got other books, he's got a lovely book out now in Santiago, but this book is about 2 years on after Martin had been exposed to Writers' Forum. And it's lovely stuff. Just as an example, but have a look at that. Excuse me again. I'll get that on the floor before I'm finished. Right. So I've apologised. I've shown you the examples, and now I shall speak. Many things come to mind when I hear the word Gestetner, but there's one thing in particular which I think of every time, and that's Writers' Forum and Bob Cobbing. The Welsh poet Peter Finch, I don't know if he's collected, but he published some poems years ago about Cobbing and the Duplicator, with huge arm developed by turning the crank and so on. I've often spoken about Bob, and I have collected them and need to recollect them in an e-book which you can get free. I keep thinking, well, I've said everything there is to say. I remember the late Eric Mottram, who was professor of English and American literature at King's. I asked him to do something for Bob's 80th, and he said, I've said everything I want to say about Bob. And then said, oh, well, wait a minute, there is maybe something I can do, and came up with something else. Bob was like that. He was a fertile person. So if you're interested in what I say, do look out that book. I'll give you details of it. My title about how to use the Gestetner to try to change the world is light-hearted-ish, but it's not meant to trivialize. If people spoke to Bob about using poetry or publishing for political purposes, he'd say, what I do is political. But that was the anarcho side of political, rather than anything else. In those days, I used to hang around with quite a few people from CPGB, and find them quite amenable. He just went very quiet when I talked like that. But he had this sense that if you work truthfully, I'm saying this, he didn't say this, it would have a good political effect. He was working to produce community. Jump cut. When he was using his Gestetner, Bob used to sing with or to the machine. And I think of it now as being like a cat purring, perhaps to illustrate the theme of Art Gorbra. There was something of that in his relationship with the machine. Others found it difficult to get really good results from, well, certainly his machine, but Bob rarely did. He would fiddle with it and work. And that was even more true of his stencil scanner. I'm not quite sure where he got it from. Didn't really have any marks much on it, and it was held together with all sorts of gizmos, but he could produce a very good electrostencil. I first met him at the end of the 1960s and began to form a friendship with him in the late 1960s, and I've shown you the two pictures that I found. I used to have a lot of stuff, and when I looked at it this week, it said, this file is corrupted, I can't do anything with it. Okay, I could beat that, but it will take time to get it back, I think, and I didn't have time. I can't remember the exact circumstances of when we began to become friendly, as opposed to just courteous. I think it may have been when I signed up for Poets' Conference, which he described as a trade union for poets. Well, there you are. It was a lobbying group, I suppose. And from there, sometime in mid-1972, Bob invited me to help him work on ALP, the Association of Little Presses. And I was the secretary of that. There was no demand, no competition, and I was that for 7 years. And then we fell out for a bit and didn't talk to each other for a bit. That organisation, ALP, produced lots of printed material, catalogues, newsletters. Can't read it. Jump cut. From the early 1950s, I think 51, but I'm not sure, it may have been 52, until 1963, Cobbing had been secretary of Arts Together. This was Hendon Arts Together. An apparently large and administratively quite complex artist-led organisation which seems to have had meetings almost every night of the week. One night music, one night drama, one night poetry, painting, and so on and so forth. And one element of that whole was Writers' Forum. And in those days, meetings were quite formal. There was an agenda, poems were circulated in advance, they were discussed. The way poetry groups used to be, and some would say ought to be. In 1963, in circumstances I'm not terribly clear on, I was still at school, they broke and set up themselves. He, Jeff Nuttall, and a couple who will be mentioned later on, I believe, and a couple of others. But Bob was always first among equals. God knows what that says. I don't know when they got their hands on an ink duplicator, but it was, as I've written here, an opportunity crying out for such a machine. It should be noticed that his earliest Gestetner graphic dates from 1942. He was a conscientious objector. Maybe the farm where they sent him had a Gestetner, I don't know. But that's, he knew about them, he knew what they could do. But in those days, and in fact throughout, they didn't just use the Gestetner, they used the Gestetner mostly. But if he or his wife was doing a little bit of lecturing in a college, they might borrow the facilities there, so you get letterpress, you get silk screen, litho, but mostly duplicating. When I first knew him, he had a Gestetner in his house. He went up the stairs, this is Randolph Avenue in Maida Vale, and down the stairs, and in the bottom of the stairs there was a cupboard, and sticking out of it was that beast. Hanging either side of the cupboard, the stencils that he'd used, which I shall come back to. I should say that his attitude to poetry was broad. What he meant by poetry. The word poetry does not appear in the title. It has writers' forum. I think that's a pity, but I wasn't there when they decided to call it writers' forum. So there was a meeting sometime in Hendon in the early 1950s, and writers' forum it was. I don't think that in those days he imagined that it would still be going in 50 years' time. So visual poetry, sound poetry was welcomed, group performance was encouraged, multi-voice poetry, an expanded idea of the subject. That was extremely unusual at the time. I suggest that the change that's occurred in some workshop environments since is a direct or indirect, I think direct, effect of writers' forum's influence, that though maybe not everyone can see that. I might find it difficult to provide solid evidence. Of necessity, Writers' Forum has been Greater London based. I mean, apart from anything else, the machine is heavy. And Bob was home based, you know. I've said somewhere else, but I'll say it now. He would get up in the morning, he would make poetry, he would go to bed at night. And when he wanted time off, he'd read poetry, he'd talk about poetry. Anyway, nowadays, because it's still going, so I shall say, we have regular participants in Yorkshire, Leeds in Yorkshire, Warwickshire, Nuneaton, and Somerset. Chap lives on the other side of the river in Bath. Anyway, back to my story. This is now early 70s. He's got an exhibition in the northeast, which I've shown you. And he suggested I stand for election to the Council of the Poetry Society, or as it was often titled then, the National Poetry Centre. That's another story again, in any detail, but it was the big thing at the time. We can take over the Poetry Society. You stand for election. And he was a very good administrator of entryism. God knows what his phone bill was like. You'd get phone, of course. And of course, there was no email, except possibly in research centres in the United States, but it was all by the phone. I got onto the General Council for about 3.5 years. And for two of them, I was the deputy chair. In the obituary of the chairman, who was not of our camp, was written up in the Telegraph that the Poetry Society was threatened with takeover by concrete poets. Not visual poets, concrete poets. There were no concrete poets. There was Bob Cobbing doing, well, let's see what I've got here that I can show you. Just break off here for a moment. That's from a visual poem intended as a score for performance. Are your children safe in the sea? Sorry? Oh, pardon me. I won't say it all again. Thank you. Are your children safe in the sea? Are your children safe in the sea? Are your children safe in the sea? Safe, etc., etc. You can see the overprinting going on there. This was 3 panels of A4 with 2 smaller ones, A5 that we would say now, at the end. So it stood around, sort of its own little amphitheatre. Recently, since his death, there have been 1 or 2 conferences on Cobbing, and people have said, did he intend his poems to be scores as such, or did we just perform them as we felt? Oh, yes, no, of course he didn't want them to be read that carefully. He did. And the people who've said that are wrong. It's been said by one person in particular, I won't name, who would never read carefully, and therefore assumes that that was the way it was meant to be. Having said that, he was an entertainer, he was a performer, and so if he was doing a collective performance of it, and someone went off on a wild tangent, he'd let it, he'd go along with it. That's from something completely different. This was from a very limited edition, big folder of visual poems. And that's 1 page from it. And he could sound that. He could justify his sounding of it. Might be a different justification each time, but he could do it. I've had to trim this because it's the image is a bit defective. But it's from a poem called Portrait of Robin Crozier. The artist Robin Crozier asked many people who had never met him to make an image of him. And that was Bob's. Crozier didn't like it, but I think the poem is good. That's from the 5 vowels. The vowel I there, as you can see. Which he liked to work with musicians. David Toop, Paul Burwell in particular. And I have no idea what that is. And when I looked at it on my laptop about an hour ago, I thought, what the hell is that? So, we'll just pass that by. But it gives you some sense of what the man did. Right. So they said that the Telegraph said we were under threat from. They seemed to think that the people he was condemning at an event were all concrete poets. The writer of this article didn't seem to see that they hated concrete poetry and was saying, doom, doom, these people are all concrete poets and they will lead you into concrete poetry. From my point of view, and as a guilty man, I'll tell you that our aim was to open up poetry, to not think that we'd done it all when we got Ted Hughes down. He did come. But we wanted some other things. And the first thing, in fact, that I remember happening in '72 was, I don't know if any of you remember, what was it called? There was a huge international festival. There were poetry trains going from London to Glasgow, all organised by an American called Harvey Matchesar, who couldn't be found when the bills came in. But as a result of his invitations, 4 poets came over from Stockholm, from Föreningen Fylkingen, and they put on an evening of text-sound composition. a term that many, particularly United States poets, seem to think is an American idea. It's actually a Swedish idea. Lars Bedin and Bengt Emil Jansson coined it one day in 1967 at a conference. You know, what do we call it? We're going to talk about it. What do we call it? So they called it text, ljud, komposition. So quadraphonic was really quite exciting and fairly newish, and it resounded through the building at Earl's Court Square and confirmed in the minds of many that the last days were indeed upon us. And it was around then that people said, since Bob Cobbing took over, he's only brought in his friends. So anyway, the Arts Council of Great Britain, the man in charge of the literature department famously said, a poet only needs a pencil and a piece of paper. So therefore our grant applications were ridiculous. So they cut the money, and our answer was to build a print shop at the Poetry Society. And with such money as we could get from the Society's accounts, we got a litho, a folder, a page folder, a plate maker, and so on, the basics. And then people brought in their own equipment. I took in a letterpress. I was pleased to get it out of the house because it wasn't there accusing me at home, why don't you use me? Bob took in his machine, and we said that we would open it up to anyone that could demonstrate that they could use the equipment, which meant that people said they won't let us use it. They couldn't use it. But there you are, for the many, not the few, we had a print shop that produced all the Society's documentation, including the Poetry Review, which at that time was also causing a lot of trouble because we were publishing Americans. Right. Let's think of Bob in his machine, with his machine, in his cupboard at the bottom of the stairs. And let's think of the basis of the Gestetner, which, because I in my early days used a different brand of duplicator, I can make the comparison. If you ink up an uneven, a document which is unevenly distributed with ink, you know, it's not just words, there are pictures, you get builds up of ink under the stencil. And it's you can work it back in to a certain extent. But Bob used to make monotypes with it. And so you would have the stencils hanging up on the wall, and then you would have a space around the photocopier with inky bits of paper slowly drying. When they dried, then he collaged them. And that's how he made some of those items that you've seen. If you get to see Winter Poem, which I looked for a copy this morning and couldn't find it. I did do a repro of it on a photocopier in early part of this century, but I couldn't find it today. But you can see where he's used two different kinds of ink blot, one very fine, one darker. And it looks very beautiful, and his performance of it was outstanding. You would think you were in a winter landscape. As well as the monotypes, sometimes his wife, Jennifer Pike, who was also an artist, would take pictures. He might go for a walk and see something lying on the ground in Randolph Avenue, just got a long open green in the middle of the road. So the new river runs underneath. And you go back, Jennifer, there's a wonderful thing. By the elm tree up there, And she'd go out with a camera and take a picture, and then he would scan it and so on. I've spoken of his scanner. He could make it work, and I've written here, others were permitted, but none, I think, were able. It fought back. It tried to collaborate, but sometimes relied upon different aesthetic processes. He started out based on the word. There's an example in what I showed you of, are your children safe in the sea? And before that, there were linear poems, so he was always fairly free in laying them out. But he slowly moved into a more visual mode of expression. Before Are Your Children Safe in the Sea, he had a poem called, or maybe it was after, I don't know, had a poem called Beethoven Today, which was exhibited at an exhibition on the South Bank on Beethoven. And there's a man who should be ashamed of himself once wrote about the value of a poem which has only 2 words in it. He'd added them up, you see, Beethoven Today. But if you actually look, Bob's only used one, Beethoven. Printed backwards, printed upside down, every which way. I interviewed him around 1998, 1999, at the instigation of the late Alaric Sumner, who wanted to praise Bob. And when I interviewed him, I said, did he see what he was doing as essentially different to poetry? And I got, I was doing it to be provocative, and I got a long lecture on, I of all people, or something like that, should know that originally everything artistic was seen, poetry was the top. Hadn't I read my Aristotle? Didn't I know about the Muses? Everything was a subgenre of poetry. And he thought that everything he did was attenuated language. Attenuated, okay, but it's all language. Fragments of language, fragments of unknown alphabets. There was an exhibition of the Westminster group, which named itself after the Gloucester group of John Furnival and chap from Prinnage, Dom Sylvester Huidar, where a person who didn't really approve of Bob's aesthetics, his name escapes me at the moment, he went up to one of Bob's exhibits in the exhibition. He said, "What's this, Bob? What's that? That looks like an upside-down U." And Bob said, "Well, I expect that's what it is." "Well, what's the sound of an upside-down U?" "That's exactly the question I'm asking. What is the sound of an upside-down U? Do you want to find out with me?" And the man withdrew very quickly because he didn't like sounding visual poems, whereas Bob said poetry is to be sounded always. He tended, though, to avoid direct theoretical statements. And yet, having said that, if you go back over things he said, you find over the years he said quite a few of them. But he liked to get other people to say. When Chris Cheek, now in the United States, teaching in the United States, wrote his doctorate on Bob, Bob claimed not to understand a word of it. I don't read academic papers, Lawrence. Can you understand it? And I said, yes. I fell into his trap, you see. He said, I can't understand this. But then he cut it up. in such a way that it was quite clear he fully understood it. In the mid-80s, the Cobbings moved from Maida Vale to where I mentioned Petherton Road at Highbury. And during the course of the move, the Gestetner was damaged irreparably. And that created a complex difficulty because they were hard to find, supplies were getting short, and he didn't have any money. So there was an interim for some time. And at the end of that interim, I think I know who it was, I won't say, someone put up the money for a photocopier. And he started again. Where he could make a Gestetner print exactly what he wanted, now he could make a photocopier print exactly what he wanted. And I was saying to someone quite recently, that when he might, the photocopier brought regular calls from the engineers, and I remembered also that there are occasional visits from Gestetner engineers. When he showed them what he was trying to do, they said, well, you can't do that. And then he would show them things where he'd done it. Oh, blimey, governor. So now, 1984-85, he's got a photocopier, and he starts all over again. Cheap, well-made booklets, beautifully produced, achieving qualities in production that were widely held to be unachievable, as I've just said. He made a selection of what he thought were his most successful visual poems on the Gestetner, and he remade them on the photocopier. And you being aficionados will know it's not just a matter of photocopying them. We had to rework them and produce this in a clear plastic wallet, and sold that very cheaply. Everything had to be cheap. It had to be affordable. He, except for the Artist Book Fair, he largely eschewed the term artist book because they attracted a high price, and he didn't want a high price. But his books were, by any stretch of the imagination, artists' books in terms of their quality. And I've worked a little bit with the book artist Guy Begbie, who holds Bob in such high esteem. Getting towards the end. He had a big room now, he'd got a photocopier. At the new place in Petherton Road, the basement, they lived in the kitchen and the bedroom, which was on the first floor. And in the basement, two rooms and a toilet. And one room was Jennifer's studio and the other room was Bob's studio. So, at the same time, and underlying this, and coming before it, if you like, is the workshop, which met every 2 or 3 weeks for 50 years, or 40 in the form in which I knew it. And it's still going. Briefly, no one tells you you mustn't do it like that. So I've got a suggestion how you could do it better. And we find that people who are not amenable to our interests, whether it's a linear poem or a visual, they go away and we carry on. When he was dying, we said, Bob, what's going to happen to your poetry? He said, it doesn't matter. It'll find its own way. But I want you to try and keep the workshop open. So he appointed 2 of us because he didn't want it to be a tyranny, said the man who'd run it solely on his own for years. And we fell out. And from about 2010, I've been on my own. He went, I stayed, and other people have joined me. That attitude to his poetry, I think, is quite significant. What he saw was important was the gathering of like-minded people who could influence each other and learn from each other. Once he was dead, getting very near the end now, once he was dead, factions broke out. You know, Alexander the Great did quite well, but it all fell apart afterwards. And there was a coup d'etat, which was very carefully timed and planned, but atrociously organised. And I was visited and told that we're taking over. And I said, no, you're not. And they went away. And so now there are two writers' forums. One writers' forum calls itself Second Series, which they occasionally drop, so they call themselves writers' forum. And this confuses people. I've met people at readings who say, I go to writers' forums. No, you don't. You go to the other writers' forum. But we continue. I've typified them in the past that if you get into an aesthetic debate with them, they won't say, well, I don't agree, or I haven't found it so. They'll say, that's not what my tutor says. And I'll just leave that hanging. Keats remarked that if poetry comes not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. Does overstate it a little, but there is an idea there. I remember that a day or two after the mass resignation of the Poetry Society, because the Arts Council of Great Britain won, Bob said, let's organise a picket of the Poetry Society. And a colleague of mine said, no, let's go home and write some more and bury these idiots under new work. And I felt that was actually better. So, you know. And Bob came round when he found it was him and Bill Griffiths. And that went on for a while and then stopped. I tend to call Writers' Forum WF rather than Writers' Forum now, which takes away that problem with writers. And also foolishly, I haven't brought the, I think I may have it. But, you know, I answer to Writers' Forum and WF and anything else really. Workshop. There've been changes. Print's expensive, but it's not so hideously expensive as it once was, it seems to me, or maybe I know good printers. But things have changed, and where once upon a time, if you weren't going to Faber and Faber, it was Writers' Forum, unless you wanted the one-off publication. But Bob saw that it was necessary, I think rightly, that it was necessary to have a proper organisation where you could go and say, show me some poetry. So we produce very few books. You've seen some of them, but it's rare. That's partly economic, partly my time. I mean, I'm just not so enthusiastic about making books. I want to make my own work. We still meet. My house is not full of, well, it's full of books, but it's not full of piles of paper with a cat on or in. There's always a cat in the heap of paper. and Bob, making up books. So we just concentrate, we use the internet, we show work, we produce a magazine called Pocket Litter, which you're welcome to receive copies of. It's free. We send it through the post. We give copies to those that turn up, and then we email PDFs to everyone else. I think that's. I'm sorry about the way this has been broken up, but I think that's about what I want to say. We continue, as I say. I think we're about to be evicted again from our base. We're at Leicester Square now. One of those little alleys that I'm told that the lady who wrote Harry Potter got her ideas for the diagonal, the alley, where full of musicians. There are bookshops and print shops and so on, and we're in the basement of one of those. But they're going to want an awful lot of money from us soon. So if anyone's got a room, it'd be very nice. I'm serious. Let me see if I've got...
Should we go to some questions?
Yes, can I just say what I thought was going to come, and then by all means do go to questions. My book is called Commentaries on Bob Cobbing, and it's from Argotist eBooks. I've said here 1912, it was 2012 of course. Commentaries on Bob Cobbing, Argotist eBooks. That will find it if you Google that. Questions, by all means.
Does anyone have any questions? Thank you also very much, Lawrence. Fantastic talk.
You're very gracious and private.
Thank you. What happened to his archive?
Sorry?
What happened to his archive?
It's in the British Library. Anything else?
Any other questions for Lawrence?
Yeah, I am wondering if you remember if he had a scanner.
A scanner, yes.
Okay.
He had an immensely old scanner, which was sort of had the feeling of the sacred about it. There were a few of us allowed to use it. I was one, but I never did, because all I did was fried the stencil. But he sometimes it did completely other than he wanted, but he accepted the result and said, well, that's a new poem. But he had a scanner, yeah. And he could draw onto stencils very well.
What was his relationship with images with his poetry, or did he see the poems becoming images themselves?
Yes. I mean, he would write words, poems of words. Sometimes things that were quite very simple. Poetry is like walking a tightrope. Sometimes it comes off, sometimes you do. But he wasn't given particularly to writing a poem and then having an image. The poem was the image, which he would then perform. If you could read a poem, you could read a poem. And so if the poem was twisted up, so the voice was twisted up. I had in mind, not written here, that we were performing, we did this thing called domestic ambient noise. It had over 1,800 images in it. We did it over 6 years. And we were performing it at the workshop one day. So this would be mid-90s. And he was jumping up and down and waving his arms and making verbal noises. And I snatched his copy out of his hand and tore it up, threw it on the floor. And I wouldn't do that to everyone, it's a little bit aggressive. And he just got down on his knees and picked up a scrap. And get another one. And read his way through it in this changed form. I mean, it was a party piece.
Lawrence, a bit of an odd question, but do you remember, can you tell me whether he was right-handed or left-handed?
He was right-handed.
You have to elaborate now, Jim. You've got everyone too curious.
The photograph, the Utfart photo, he was, his left hand was gesturing.
Maybe. But, no, he was right-handed. I can see him, well, with the Gestetner, I can see him standing there, cranking there. And, yeah, just...
The Gestetner's not easy to use if you're left-handed.
No, he was right-handed, definitely. But I think, he'd give it a go if he had to.
I was going to ask what the influence of Bob Cobbing is on your own work, Lawrence.
Considerable. One bit that I skipped over here. Sometime, be about 94, 95, I looked at some boxes of stuff which I'd brought with me from when I moved the last time. And I looked at poem after poem, visual poem, and thought, well, that's just regurgitated Cobbing. There's none of my ideas. And I spent weeks throwing poems away. I thought of this week because I found a box that was produced from, that pile of boxes, down to that, and I found a few which are still quite interesting. One from, must be 1980, to my stepson on his 21st birthday. It influences me. His interest in poetry as a branch of music, or a branch of music as music as a branch of poetry, or the other way around, stays with me. I was at Goldsmiths in the music department for 7 years. I like performing with musicians. You mentioned, or you read out, in my bio, that Benedict Taylor, that's not the actor, that's the violist musician. Not violist, violist. He got that. And what I did, I think Bob would appreciate, it was actually pictures of shoreline flowers and bushes on Scilly, where I spend a fair bit of my time. And I photographed it and treated it. And I've been a photographic teacher. And Benedict looks at the picture and says, oh yes, I can see what that sounds like on the viola, and off he goes. He influenced me very, very greatly. And the fact that I'm still running Writers' Forum, I think, suggests that. I took that desire that Writers' Forum Workshop, which is really what survives of Writers' Forum to any great extent, I took that very seriously. I had been thinking that I would pass it on to someone, and then we had this revolution, so I thought, well, okay, I'll do another decade. I am now actually grooming someone to take over, but they don't know they're being groomed, or I don't think they do. Yeah, tremendously. and who knows how I would have behaved if I had realised just how much that would influence me. At the time, I thought, well, it's something to do, but it's directed my whole life. Not in an oppressive way at all.
Okay, thank you very much, Lawrence Upton. Thank you very much.